There is a particular kind of silence that follows you into every room when the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally have quietly, collectively agreed to make you the problem. Not the silence of a peaceful Sunday morning where the world feels soft and unhurried. No, this is the loaded silence of a room full of people who have rehearsed it. You have felt it. You have walked through a front door after a long, bone-wearing day, and the air itself shifted the moment you stepped inside, not toward you, away from you. The house was full, and you were completely, devastatingly alone, and the worst part was not the silence itself. It was the smile you had to paste across your face and carry to the dinner table like a gift no one wanted. You know what it feels like to sit in a room full of family and feel like a stranger being quietly evaluated. The laughter stops a half-second too late when you walk in. Eyes flicker sideways when you speak. The conversation you interrupted was not actually interrupted. It simply could not survive your presence because your presence asked questions the room was not ready to answer. You have sat at tables during the holidays when the candles were lit and the food was beautiful, and you felt the phantom weight of invisibility pressing down on your chest like something physical. You forced the smile, you passed the dishes, you laughed at the right moments, and when you finally got home, you sat in the quiet and wondered if something was deeply, irreparably wrong with you. There wasn't. There never was. What was happening was not accidental dysfunction. What was being practiced around you was something far more deliberate. They studied you the way architects study a building they intend to demolish, measuring your weak points with precision, rehearsing your reactions before they triggered them, mapping the exact angle at which your confidence would fracture. The advice that left you doubting yourself was designed to do exactly that. The concern that never quite felt like concern was surveillance wearing a soft disguise. They were not stumbling through bad behavior. They were engineering your collapse with the quiet, coordinated patience of people who had convinced themselves they were entitled to your defeat. Every confused night you spent wondering what was wrong with you was exactly the outcome they had planned. You were not paranoid. You were right. And being right, finally knowing it in your bones, is the beginning of everything. That is why in the trilogy, The 3 Keys to a Prosperous Life, the link is in the pinned comment, I explain that the first wound a chosen soul must heal is not the betrayal itself. It is the lie that the betrayal taught you about your own worth. When the people closest to you spend years treating your presence as a problem to be managed, you begin to internalize their diagnosis. You shrink. You over-explain. You apologize for the way you breathe. And the most dangerous thing about that shrinking is how quietly it happens. So quietly, you barely notice the ceiling getting lower until the day you try to stand fully upright and find that you have forgotten how. That ends today. That ends here. Here is the spiritual diagnosis that changes everything about the story you have been living. In the kingdom of the Spirit, light does not simply attract warmth, it agitates darkness. Your presence in that family was not neutral. It was a disruption. Not because you were difficult or dramatic or too sensitive, but because you were different in a way that exposed every hollow, unexamined place inside them. Your honesty made their performances look cheap. Your genuine pursuit of growth made their chosen stagnation visible in ways they could not tolerate. Your capacity to feel deeply made their emotional numbness feel like a verdict they had not asked to receive. They did not target you because you were weak. They targeted you with such focus and such consistency because your very existence was a mirror they could not turn away from and could not bear to face. And here is what the body remembers long after the mind tries to make peace with it. The swallowed tears are not metaphorical. They live somewhere just below your throat, in the place where the cry gets stuck because there was never a safe moment to release it. You learned to time your grief to the shower, where the sound of water would absorb what you could not contain. You learned to schedule your breaking for private places, for the car, for the walk alone, for the pillow pressed against your face at 2 in the morning. Your nervous system became an expert at compression, holding everything down, holding everything in, performing stability for an audience that would have used your collapse as evidence for everything they had already decided about you. The body kept the score when the mind was too exhausted to count. What they created in you without intending to was a kind of extraordinary sensitivity. The isolation trained your ear to hear what is not being said. The calculated silences taught you to read the architecture of a room before you had spoken a single word. The gaslighting the patient, maddening art of making you question your own perception, pressed you so far inward that you found something none of them could reach. You found your own voice. Not the voice that had been shaped by their approval or sharpened by their criticism. Your actual voice, the one that knows, the one that has always known. The confusion they manufactured became the very furnace that burned away every version of you that was built for their comfort, until what remained was unbreakable and entirely, unapologetically yours. The Bible maps this exact pattern in stories that were never meant to be merely historical. Joseph's brothers did not throw him into the pit because he was worthless. They threw him into the pit because he carried a dream that towered above anything they could imagine for themselves, and the size of that dream was an unbearable daily accusation. The coat of many colors was not simply fabric, it was a visible declaration of favor, and favor in a house of comparison is a weapon even when it was never intended as one. They did not stumble into betrayal, they coordinated it. They sat down and ate bread after throwing him into the pit, and that detail, the bread, the meal, the normalcy of it, is the detail that should haunt you because you have sat at that table. You have eaten that bread. You have watched the people who just finished wounding you compose themselves and carry on as if nothing happened. David understood this too, in a way that went beyond theology and landed directly in the body. He was not hunted by Saul because he posed a military threat. He was hunted because his anointing made Saul's emptiness impossible to ignore. Every time David walked into a room, Saul felt the weight of what he had become reflected back at him, and that reflection was intolerable. The javelin was not military strategy. It was the physical eruption of a man who could not survive the mirror. And David ran, not because he was a coward, but because God was not finished building what the wilderness alone could build. The caves were not punishment. They were private training sessions for a very public assignment. Every cold night in hiding was curriculum. Every moment of being hunted was shaping something that a palace on its own never could have formed. God does not protect the chosen by removing the attack. That is the part that is the hardest to hold, because when you are inside it, when the coordination against you is at its peak, when you are the most confused and the most exhausted and the most convinced that something is wrong with you, the silence of heaven can feel like abandonment. But what looks like absence is often a different kind of presence. The attack is allowed because the attack is serving a purpose the attackers cannot see and were never meant to see. The pit was not punishment. It was preparation for Egypt. The wilderness was not abandonment. It was advanced formation conducted in private before a very public coronation. What they built against you, God was quietly building through. Every strategy they used against you, the isolation, the gaslighting, the smear campaigns, the emotional traps laid with the patience of people who had made your diminishment a long-term project. The universe was watching all of it, not passively, not from a distance, intentionally with the kind of attention that misses nothing, because what they meant as your destruction, heaven was quietly converting into your education. The silence they weaponized trained you to hear what is never spoken out loud. The isolation they forced removed you from the noise of their validation long enough for you to discover that you did not need it. The years of being misread and misrepresented pushed you inward past every layer of performance until you reached something solid, a self that was not constructed for their approval and therefore could not be dismantled by their withdrawal. They thought they were taking something from you. They were giving you the one thing they could never take back. Here is what they never planned for. You were supposed to stay confused. You were supposed to keep explaining yourself in circles, keep offering softer versions of your truth, keep making yourself smaller in spaces that made smallness the condition of your belonging. The entire architecture of what was built against you depended on one thing, that you would never stop doubting yourself long enough to see the pattern clearly. Your awakening was always their worst nightmare. Not because they feared you in some dramatic sense, but because the moment you stopped accepting their diagnosis of you, the entire operation began to lose its foundation. Gaslighting requires a gaslit subject. The mirror only works as a weapon if you are willing to believe what they say you see in it. The moment you stopped, the moment something in you said no, not this, not anymore, the structure they had spent years building began to develop cracks. Look at the path that led you here, not the version of it that they narrated, where you were the difficult one, the dramatic one, the one who could never just let things go. The actual path, the one that started with a child who felt too much in rooms that punished feeling. The one that moved through years of trying every variation of diminishment to see if any version of yourself small enough would finally earn you rest from the scrutiny. The one where you smiled through dinners that felt like courts of judgment. The one where you drove home in the dark and cried in the driveway before going inside because you needed to compose yourself before facing the next performance. That path was not evidence of your weakness. That path was the documentation of someone surviving something that most people never have to name. The social cost of being the light carrier in a dark family system is real, and it is specific. It shows up at Thanksgiving when the table goes quiet in the wrong way. It shows up in the way certain relatives speak about your choices in voices just loud enough to carry. It shows up in the advice that is never quite advice. It is always a little bit of a verdict. You are too sensitive. You take everything so personally. You always have to make things complicated. You heard those lines so many times, they began to feel like your own inner voice, until you could not tell anymore where their assessment ended and your self-perception began. That is the deepest wound, not the cruelty itself, but the way prolonged cruelty teaches you to carry it as identity. As I teach deeply in the material The 3 Keys to a Prosperous Life, I left the link for you in the pinned comment, this pain is not proof that something is wrong with you. It is proof that you are carrying a light inside a system that was built for darkness, and the system responded to you the way all systems respond to disruption, with force. The criticism was not information about your character. It was information about their discomfort. The constant pressure to change was not concern for your well-being. It was an attempt to extinguish something they could not understand and therefore could not control. And the fact that you survived it, that you are still here, still seeking, still willing to look clearly at what happened, that is not the result of luck. That is evidence of something in you that was protected, even when you could not feel the protection. There is a particular cruelty and envy that disguises itself as concern. It is one of the most sophisticated emotional weapons available to people who want to wound you while maintaining the posture of care. I am just worried about you, said by the same person who laid the trap you just fell into. I say this because I love you, said immediately before the observation designed to reopen the exact wound they spent years creating. The hidden envy does not announce itself. It comes dressed in the language of guidance, of tradition, of collective wisdom. It arrives at your table with a casserole and a quiet comment that finds your newest insecurity with the accuracy of something that has been rehearsed. You are not crazy for having felt that something was wrong with the care. The care was a cover. Underneath it was the thing they could not admit even to themselves, that your capacity for life, your hunger for more, your refusal to accept less, was a direct confrontation of the ceiling they had chosen to live under. The social contract of a controlling family system is unspoken but absolute. It says, you may belong here, but only if you agree to stay at a height that does not make anyone else feel low. The moment you began to grow beyond that ceiling, not aggressively, not to shame anyone, simply by following the pull of who you actually were, the contract was considered broken, and they came to collect. The meetings held without you, the conversations you were not invited to, the alliances formed in the quiet places between your visits, those were not overreactions. Those were the enforcement mechanisms of a system that had made your containment a collective project. You were not imagining the coordination. You were correctly perceiving the architecture of something that had been constructed very carefully around you. Jesus walked into the synagogue where he had grown up and read from the scroll of Isaiah, and the room that had known him as a child looked at him with a particular kind of fury that only proximity to greatness can generate in a person who has not reckoned with their own smallness. Is this not the carpenter's son? Not a question of curiosity, a question of enforcement, a reminder of the ceiling. And then the text says something devastating, that because of their unbelief, he could do very few miracles there. That detail should stop you in your tracks. It is not that he lacked the power, it is that the atmosphere created by people who had decided who he was allowed to be formed a resistance that even miracle could not fully penetrate. Some environments are not simply unsupportive, they are actively incompatible with what you carry. And the most loving thing heaven can do is remove you from them. This is what the removal feels like from the inside, like loss, like failure, like the dream of belonging finally dying the death you had been trying to prevent for years. When God begins to pull you out of an environment that was built to limit you, the extraction rarely feels like rescue in the moment. It feels like the last thread snapping. It feels like rejection finally completing itself. But look at what follows the removal. Look at what happens to Joseph after the pit. Not immediately, not without more difficulty, but arc by arc, chapter by chapter. The removal was not the ending, it was the relocation. The place that felt like your burial was the beginning of your transit to a completely different territory. One where what you carried could finally operate at its full volume without constant suppression. The warning embedded in Lot's wife is one of the most precise spiritual diagnoses of the human condition I know. She was being saved. The angels were literally holding her hands and leading her toward life, and she looked back, not at what she hated, at what she was used to, at the familiar, even though the familiar was killing her. And she became a pillar of salt, permanently preserved in the posture of a person who could not let go of the old fire, even as the new life was already opening in front of her. You know the pull. You have felt it. The pull back toward the people who hurt you, not because they were good to you, but because their rejection was the rejection you had learned to recognize as home. The pull toward one more conversation, one more attempt at explanation, one more offering of your clarity to people who were never confused, only resistant. Do not turn back. The fire behind you is not your story, it is your history. The danger of looking back is not simply that you will be sad. The danger is that you will let their version of you follow you into your new life, that you will carry their language about who you are into rooms where no one has ever spoken that language about you, that you will pre-apologize for your light in spaces that are actively hungry for it, that you will manage your own expansion because some part of you is still trying to make someone comfortable who made their peace with your diminishment a long time ago. The pillar of salt is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is just the habit of shrinking. Sometimes it is just the voice that says, "Who do you think you are?" in the exact tone of someone who spent years asking you that as an accusation rather than a question. God did not remove those people and those ties from your life carelessly. The removals that felt like losses, the relationships that unraveled, the group that quietly expelled you, the family dynamic that finally broke past the point of repair. Each one was a severing of something that had a cord running directly into your purpose, draining it. Some connections are not just unhealthy. They are architecturally incompatible with the assignment written over your life. As long as you were in them, pouring energy into maintaining belonging in systems that had made your limitation their project, the mission could not move. The removal was not punishment for failing to make the relationship work. It was a surgical intervention by a God who was unwilling to let the assignment be endlessly delayed by the maintenance of connections that were built to contain you. The chains you carry are not only yours. Epigenetics has a spiritual equivalent. The patterns that move through bloodlines like inherited weather, the unspoken rules that pass from parent to child without ever being named, the fear and the silence, and the way certain feelings were always too large for the rooms they were raised in. You felt this. You felt the way your instinct toward truth was a disruption, not just to your generation, but to every generation that had agreed, without ever agreeing out loud, that honesty was too expensive and peace was preferable to reality. You were not simply the difficult child in your family. You were the place where the suppressed truth of an entire lineage tried to surface. The pressure you felt was not just the pressure of your own life. It was the accumulated weight of everything that had never been allowed to breathe. The breaking of those chains is not a moment. It is a process with a sound and a cost. It sounds like setting a boundary for the first time in a room that has no architecture for your refusal. It sounds like the silence after you say no to something that every generation before you said yes to out of fear. It feels like standing on ground that has not been tested and finding slowly that it holds. The purging of what was inherited is holy work, not because it is comfortable, but because it is finally honest. Every chain you refuse to pass forward is a gift to people you will never meet, your children, your children's children, the lineage that will live downstream from the moment you decided the old agreement was over. And now, the accounting. The universe keeps every receipt. It does not lose track of subtle cruelty simply because the wounds were invisible. It does not file away emotional warfare as a minor infraction because no one saw the damage from the outside. It watches with the patience of something that does not measure time the way we do. And when it moves with a completeness that cannot be bargained with, cannot be reversed, and cannot be softened by the charm of people who performed innocence while they were building your trap. Look at them now, honestly. The confident stories they rehearsed are no longer matching up. The alliances they built require maintenance they did not plan for. The mask is not slipping, it is shattering, and the pieces are sharp enough to cut them on the way down. You do not need revenge. You never did. The desire for revenge is simply the grief of a person who has not yet seen the correction begin. Once the correction begins, once you can see with your own eyes that what was built against you is now collapsing under its own weight, the appetite for revenge dissolves, not because you have become noble, because you no longer need it. The universe's accounting is so thorough, so precise, so tailored to the specific shape of what was done, that anything you could engineer would be crude by comparison. Your only job now is to be so fully, so unapologetically alive in your new life that the contrast itself becomes the testimony. Your rise is the verdict. Your clarity is the consequence they never planned for. Your healing, the actual cellular bone-deep healing that began when you stopped accepting their diagnosis and started looking clearly at the pattern. That healing was the trigger. The moment you stopped doubting yourself, The architecture they had built around your confusion lost its load-bearing wall because the entire structure depended on you cooperating with the story they had written about you. The moment you withdrew your cooperation, the story had no protagonist to carry it. They needed you confused, drained, and small, because a confused and drained and small version of you was the only version their power could survive. Your awakening was not just your liberation. It was the single event their entire strategy had been designed to prevent, and it happened anyway. The solitude that remains after the removal is not the same as the loneliness of being surrounded by the wrong people. This is a different quality of quiet, cleaner, more spacious. There is room in it to hear your own thoughts without the static of other people's agendas running underneath everything. You are learning, slowly perhaps but irrevocably, that your own company is extraordinary, that the self you have been getting acquainted with in the absence of the performances and the management and the constant negotiation is someone genuinely worth knowing. This solitude is not a waiting room. It is a formation. It is the space in which everything you are about to become is quietly assembling itself, the way light gathers before dawn, without announcement, without requiring any audience to validate its arrival. Your new tribe is already in motion toward you. They are not being manufactured for your comfort. They are being drawn by the signal of a life that has been through the fire and was not destroyed by it. They speak the language of people who have survived what they were not supposed to survive, who carry scars they no longer need to hide, who do not require you to make yourself smaller so they can feel at ease. They will recognize you without an introduction, not because you will perform for them, but because something in your energy, the particular quality of light that suffering refines, that cannot be faked and cannot be borrowed, will speak directly to something in them that has been waiting for exactly this kind of resonance. The loneliness is ending, not gradually, in a way that will take your breath away. What was taken from you is being returned. And the return is not a quiet correction. The return is a reversal so complete, it will require a new category of understanding. The years of smallness are becoming the full measure of your authority. The isolation is resolving into discernment, the ability to read a room, a person, an invitation with a precision that no one who was always comfortable could have developed. The confusion that was manufactured to keep you manageable has become a clarity that is devastating in its accuracy. The pain was curriculum, the humiliation was formation, the rejection was redirection, and the sum of all of it is a human being standing at a threshold that the people who tried to bury you could not even see from where they are standing. Stand tall, chosen one. You were never falling. You were being positioned. The pit was not your grave. It was your launch point. The wilderness was not your punishment. It was your private preparation for a public assignment that is larger than anything your former environment could have contained. The family that made you feel like a problem was simply too small a theater for the story that was written over your life. And everything, every dinner that felt like a tribunal, every silence that felt like a verdict, every tear swallowed in the shower, every night spent wondering if something was wrong with you, every single moment of it was being archived by a universe that does not waste pain. It was all being converted. It was all being used. And what it was building was you, exactly as you are right now, standing at the edge of the life that was always yours, finally ready to claim it without apology. That is why in the trilogy, The 3 Keys to a Prosperous Life, the link is in the pinned comment, I go deep into the exact process of moving from survived to chosen, from the person who endured what was built against them to the person who walks fully into the assignment that endurance was preparing them for. Everything you have been through has been building towards something. The link is there. The door is open. What you do next is yours.